Hi there, I'm Christopher Smith, Product Manager of Philadelphia Mixing Solutions. We have several technical experts ready to assist with the installation and use of your mixer. In this particular video, I'll show you how to install the upgraded inboard bearing assembly on your PMSL side entry mixer. Don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, and you can also find more information on our website at philamixers.com. We're available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to take your call in an emergency.
First, make sure you take care of any safety precautions in accordance with your company's requirements. This includes, but is not limited to, lockouts, tagouts, and personal protective equipment. We also recommend wearing gloves, as there are several pinch points on this mixer. To begin, remove the side covers and then remove the back belt cover. Once your safety covers have been removed, you'll have full access to the belt-driven system. For this video, the auto and manual swivel is disconnected, so there's more room for you to see the installation process. Lower and reduce the height of the motor to reduce the tension on the belt. I recommend only loosening the top nut on the adjustment bolts, and the bottom nut can remain in place, allowing you to easily reset the belt tension later. Loosen the same nuts on the opposite side of the mixer. You'll know you have the motor dropped down low enough when you can safely remove the belt off the rear of the mixer. Next, we'll remove the bottom sprocket assembly from the mixer. This process may be different depending on the style you have. Refer to your unit's installation and operations manual for specific information. This is a Goodyear Eagle NRG sprocket with a QD taper lock bushing. It has a set screw that goes over the top of the key. Loosen the set screw and back it out far enough so you don't drag it along the key when removing the sprocket. Measure and note the distance from the face of the taper bushing to the end of the shaft. You may need help of a second person as the sprocket can be very heavy. Use the jacking bolts to release the taper and remove the taper bushing and sprocket. Put the sprocket and taper bushing aside. Remove the key and then remove the snap ring off the back of the mixer. Next, we're going to lock out the mixer. The shaft moves forward into a metal-to-metal tapered shutoff. Loosen the set screws and lock nuts. Note that there are 3 set screws on the inboard bearing assembly and 3 set screws on the outboard bearing assembly. First, you loosen the nuts, and you can rotate the shaft by hand to make this a little bit easier. Now loosen the set screws. The set screws should be backed out about 1.5 turns so they clear the shaft and any areas of the shaft. When the set screws are loose, set the key away in the back so it faces down. Next, install the setting tabs and loosen the clamp collar on the mechanical seal. Some of our mechanical seal setting tabs work differently from this. Determine what setting tabs and locking device your seal has. This one happens to be a Philadelphia Mixing Solutions standard mechanical seal. The setting tabs are little bobbins. Loosen the bobbin and roll it into location. Once the setting tabs are locked into place, unlock the mechanical seal sleeve of the shaft. In this case, this is done with a clamp collar. Loosen the clamp collar, and in some seals this is done with set screws, and you'll have to move around the shaft to loosen all the set screws, but only after your setting tabs are in place. On models with a clamp collar, you know it's loose when you can move the clamp collar slightly. Make sure the check valve works by opening the check valve. Some liquid should come out, and then you can close the check valve. This procedure works best with 2 people. To lock out the mixer, first slightly loosen up the L99 bolts. Once they're loosened, back out the U75 bolts until the tips are still engaged in the shutoff housing. Start tightening down the L99 bolts. As the bolts are tightened, the shaft will move through the bearing and sleeve. A gap will begin to occur, on the rear bearing between the snap ring and the outboard bearing sleeve. If you encounter any issues, for example if the bolts jam up or if something isn't moving, reevaluate and ensure the set screws are loose, the snap ring is removed from the rear of the mixer, and there are no issues with the mechanical seal. When all 4 L99 bolts are tightened down, make sure the mechanical seal in the mixer has been locked out and that no product will leak as you proceed. It is normal for some liquid to come out when you first open the check valve, but after it stops and no more liquid comes out, the shutoff has been successful. Loosen and remove the 4 bolts holding the outboard bearing assembly. Once they're removed, the housing should rotate 90 degrees. If it's very tight or does not rotate, use the remove bolts in the jacking holes to jack the bearing housing off. When the housing is loose enough, pull it off the back of the mixer and set aside the bearing housing. Remove the key and then remove the snap ring. Loosen and remove the 4 bolts holding the inboard bearing assembly. Use 2 of the bolts as jacking bolts in the tapped holes, 1 on each side. Carefully jack the bearing flange off the mixer, bringing it off the shaft. Only move a little on each side at a time. If 2 people are moving the assembly, each can crank on opposite sides. With the bearing housing loose, remove the bolts and pull the housing out the back of the mixer. Remove the key. And clean off any excess anti-seize compound, dirt, using a rag or an abrasive pad. Knock down any burrs or high points on the shaft. Slide the bearing assembly on from the back of the housing into the same location as the previous assembly. Note that we are not installing a key. Tighten the 4 bolts going on equal sides, drawing the clamp sleeve onto the shaft. Next, install a snap ring onto the outboard bearing area. Install the key and apply anti-seize compound into the bearing journal. Note that we did not put any anti-seize compound onto the inboard bearing clamp journal. Make sure the key lines up with the keyway in the sleeve. When the outboard bearing assembly is completely against the snap ring, you can rotate the outboard bearing housing 90 degrees. Then you install the outer snap ring. Install the bolts for the outboard bearing housing on the opposite side, just finger tight. Do not tighten down the set screws yet. Disengaging the lockout is the reverse of engaging the lockout. With an assistant, loosen the L99 bolts, first removing 1 from each side and then slowly loosening the remaining 2. Make sure there's no leak at the mechanical seal. Occasionally, the tank contents pressure will move the assembly out. Completely remove the L99 bolts from the shutoff plate. After the L99 bolts are removed, working in a cross pattern and advancing each screw no more than 1/16 at a time, tighten the 4 U75 bolts. If you have a second person, tighten the opposite one simultaneously. Pressure from the tank and the grip of the mechanical seal O-ring may move the shaft outwards. Stop tightening when the unlocking screws are snug and the mechanical seal gland plate rests against the head of the 4 stainless steel shoulder bolts. Do not tighten or loosen the shoulder bolts. Adjusting the shoulder bolts can result in catastrophic failure. Tighten the bolts that mount the outboard bearing assembly to the housing. This will pull the shaft back and into location. With the shutoff plate in position, flush with the heads of the bolts, loosen the U75 bolts 2 to 3 rotations and apply Loctite 246 on all 4 U75 bolts. Torque the U75 bolts to 350 inch-pounds. Torque them in a star pattern. Once properly torqued, apply Loctite 246 to the very tip of the bolts to be installed in the L99 holes. Torque the L99 bolts to 600 inch-pounds. Make sure to use a star pattern. Tighten down the clamp collar. On models with set screws, tighten down the set screws. Check the seal drawing or installation and operations manual for proper torque values. When tightening the clamp collar on the mechanical seal, tighten it evenly to ensure gap on each side is approximately equal. After the clamp collar or set screws are tightened, release the mechanical seal setting tabs, but you do not need to completely remove them from the mixer. Just roll them out of the way. Ensure that the shaft rotates. Slowly open the air relief valve on the mechanical seal and drain all air trapped within the seal and collect tank fluids from the valve in a rag or catch can. Next, torque down the 4 bolts on the inboard and outboard bearing housings. Torque bolts to 55 foot-pounds for the BSER 6 and 8, or 257 foot-pounds for the BSER 10 and 12. Tighten all 3 set screws in the outboard bearing sleeve to 50 inch-pounds with the jam nuts loose to allow the set screws to fully support the shaft. Then final torque the set screws to 205 inch-pounds on the BSER 6 and 8 or 327 inch-pounds on the BSER 10 and 12, being sure that the jam nuts are loose. Torque the jam nuts to 120 inch-pounds on the BSER 6 and 8 or 200 inch-pounds on the BSER 10 and 12. Be sure to hold the set screw in place and that they don't move as you're tightening them. Note that these screws have red locking compound applied, which can be reused, but when an existing bearing housing or existing bearing sleeve in the older style set screws, be sure to apply Loctite 276 prior to tightening. Ensure all bolts around the outside of the collar are loose and can easily be spun by hand. This removes all the clamping force. For older mixers with a bearing life on the shaft of 2 3/8 inch or less, you will need to install shaft spacers. Slide them in by hand between the shaft and the clamping device. Insert one on the top using a piece of wood to help slide it in. The shaft spacer should be nearly flush with the bolt heads. It's about 1/4 inch from the collar to the edge of the shaft spacer. Install one on the other side as well. It's usually easier to rotate the shaft and install the shaft spacer on the top as gravity helps it fit in. Set the gap on the inboard bearing before tightening down the inboard bearing assembly. Inside the bearing housing, each side of the bearing must have a small gap to allow for thermal growth and shrinkage. With a hammer, slowly hit the bearing assembly to create about a 1/16 inch gap on each side between the bearing and the bearing flange. Once there is an equal gap on each side, start tightening down the socket cap screws. Make them all finger tight to begin and go around in a circle, sequentially around the sleeve. Do not use a star pattern. Measure the gap between the outside collar and the bearing sleeve using feeler gauges. To get the desired clamping force, the collar gap should decrease by 16 to 21 thousandths of an inch on the BSER 6 and 8, 21 to 26 thousandths of an inch on the BSER 10, and 18 to 22 thousandths of an inch on a BSER 12. Tighten the bolts by making about a half turn of rotation on each bolt. Move sequentially around the collar, not in a star pattern. Continue going until the gap has decreased the required amount using feeler gauges. You may need to repeat tightening until the gap is equally spaced all around the clamp collar, and the gap is reduced the correct amount. Take a runout measurement at the mechanical seal, using a dial indicator with a magnetic base. Install the dial indicator onto the mixer perpendicular to the shaft. Rotate the shaft 360 degrees and determine the runout at the mechanical seal. If the runout is greater than 2 thousandths of an inch, try loosening the inboard bearing clamp and retightening it to try and reduce the runout. If this doesn't work, please contact the factory. The lower sprocket can be heavy and may require a second person to help install it. Put the key in and install the sprocket and taping bushing. Using the measurement that you had taken before, move the sprocket into the proper location. Ensure the motor and drive sprockets are aligned by taking a flat edge against the sprockets. As you tighten the taper bushing, the sprocket will pull back a little, so leave a slight gap. Tighten the taper bushing and recheck the alignment. Once aligned, torque down the bolts on the taper bushing. The torque value is dependent on the mixer size, the ratio kit, and the type of belt assembly. Refer to the installation and operations manual. If the mixer has a set screw over the key, be sure to tighten it. Place the belt over the sprockets and make sure that all the teeth line up. Begin tightening the motor bolts. As long as the bolts on the bottom are not moved, the belt tension should be about the same. Do a full rotation of the belt and verify sprocket alignment. Next, check the belt tension. At the factory, we use a sonic meter to determine belt tension. It works by reading the belt frequency when you fling it or flick it, returning a Hertz value. Refer to your installation and operations manual for belt tension specifications and tolerance, and adjust the bolts accordingly. Your sales representative or a Philadelphia Mixing Solutions technical support person can give you a belt tension value for your mixer. Attach the rear belt cover. Replace the access covers on the side of the mixer. If you have a manual swivel mixer, ensure the manual swivel arm is tight by loosening the lock nut and torquing down the bolt that drives the swivel arm into its pin. Torque the bolt to 55 foot-pounds on the BSER 6 and 8 or 200 foot-pounds on the BSER 10 and 12. Torque the locking nut to 40 foot-pounds on the BSER 6 and 8 or 150 foot-pounds on the BSER 10 and 12. It should be good and tight.
This completes the installation of the upgraded inboard bearing assembly. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to us here at the factory or to your local sales rep, and we'll be happy to support you in any way possible. Thank you very much.